This is Selma Woodard, my grandmother. Over the years, during various conversations, she's made passing remarks about surviving World War II as a lost child, but has never given me the full story. When I was 13 years old, I attempted to make a documentary about her experiences, but she wasn't ready to recount these traumatic memories chronologically yet, and I wasn't ready to make a film yet. Over the past 4 years, she has written vignettes of her trauma in German and has worked through many emotional barriers. She's finally at a point emotionally where she can cover most of her story chronologically, and I'm finally at a point as a filmmaker that I can make this documentary now that I'm almost 18. So this is my grandmother's story, from Nazi Germany to America. Enjoy.
My earliest memories was the kindergarten. A kindergarten at that time was a wonderful and happy place. We learned songs and theater. We made our own, out of crepe paper, we made costumes. And then we were able to perform on a big stage for our mothers. And I still remember songs from kindergarten. They were also old pieces of music for children, and we acted them out. That's why I remember them so well. Like there's one, Die Vogelhochzeit. A bird was getting married, and then it explained the owl was the mother, and she was crying, and I could just imagine. And that's why I remember these so well. For Mother's Day, we had a little song which we learned. It says, viel Glück und viel Segen auf all unseren Wegen. Gesundheit und Frohsinn sei mit dabei. So we were told to give our mom a pretty bouquet of flowers.
Ein Vogel wollte Hochzeit machen in dem grünen Walde. Tiralala, tiralala, tiralalalala. Die Amsel, seine Braute, trug einen Kranz von Raute. Tiralala, tiralala, tiralalalala.
As you came into the schoolroom, there was this humongous flag with a swastika, and there were no more beautiful songs that we learned in kindergarten. It was business from then on, and I did not like it a bit. So sometimes I would hear the kindergarten children coming down the road and singing the little songs, and I wish I would be there among them. So it was not a happy time. But then, of course, we started with Heil Hitler, of course, first thing in the morning. And then, of course, school started, and it's very down to business. And I hated it, absolutely hated it, but, well, we had to go to school. We were questioned in school, and I was smart enough not to open my mouth what was going on at home, because, well, my father and mother didn't think I was smart enough to understand what's happening and what they're talking about, see? And then, of course, my father was always curious what's happening in the world, and see, he had this big fancy radio, and I remember he sent my mother out on the street to watch the traffic, and she was fit to be tied, and I never understood until much later I realized that the Nazis had cars that they drove through the street, and they could tell exactly what you were listening to on the radio. And this was Radio Free Europe that my dad was listening to. That meant they would shoot you on the spot if they would have found you listening to that. So he had my mother watching the street, so, and she had a fit. And of course she was scared to death, but nobody told you anything, so this was all propaganda. So people were in the dark, and Papa, of course, always wanted to know what's happening, what's going on. At that time, when after school I would play with children in the immediate area. Didn't have any German children, there were some Polish children. And I played with them. We hide and go seek and catch and these kind of games. And my teacher, which was on the way to Kulm for shopping, came by on a bicycle and saw me playing with these children. So for that I was punished. I severely punished. And after a while, these Polish children got to be very nasty to me. He made me cry, wouldn't let me go home from school. But I never complained. But our maid, Lula, knew about it, and she mentioned it to my parents. And from then on, my father became my babysitter. He took me with him wherever he was going, whether it was the dairy or the mill, or even to Kulm for shopping. He took me along because I could no longer be alone on my own. Times were getting difficult, and it changed very drastically. So the good times were over. And on rainy days, I spent my days in the attic of the house. There were many, many boxes with books. I loved books, so I had a lot of fun. Look at the pictures, and there were quite a few also medical books. You could take the whole body of a human being apart. That fascinated me. Papa had to go, also was taken and was had to be in uniform, and we didn't see him much anymore. That must have been 1944 or so. Until then, he was home. We seldom saw him anymore. But whenever he came home, I never saw him in uniform ever. He hated it, absolutely hated it. Because you could feel the fear. There was a certain amount of fear, and nobody knew what was coming next. The programs that we heard were not very good, and the pictures in the newspapers were horrible, so people became very, very frightened. Papa happened to be there one time, and he was on a field. And I happened to be there too, of course, with my dad. It was harvest for sugar beets at that time. So Babka showed up with coffee and lunch for us all. And then she disappeared in a ravine and wanted to pick some berries. And it didn't take very long. She showed up, she was white as a sheet, and she says, "The partisans down there, partisans, they're having lunch." So they didn't see Babka, but she was very much afraid. So we knew the whole area was under attack already at that time. They were searching out the country. That's what partisans do. And in school also we were warned, be careful, never to talk to these people, and so on. And so it was a frightful time. Then Papa made a fortress out of the house. It had heavy, big, thick walls, but in front of every window he had heavy doors that he made. We could open it in the daytime, but in the evening they were closed. So even if somebody was shooting, it wouldn't go through, you know. So it was a fortress, and nobody ever opened the doors after dark. So and then Papa came home one time, and I saw him giving my mom a pistol. And he knew sooner or later either we would have to leave or whatever. But he gave her a pistol, he says, in case we were overrun by the Russians, to kill us first and then herself. And that's what many people have done. And I saw that, and it frightened me very much. my mom wanted to see her mother one more time. She was very ill in bed and was not expected to live much longer. She was diabetic, and my aunt, which lived later on in Ohio, she took care of her. And so we took the train, got off the train, and there was a person that she knew with horse and buggy. He picked us up, and then he went a certain few kilometers, and he said, I cannot go any further. It's just too dangerous. And so he let us off, and we walked. We walked the rest of the road to the village where my grandmother lived. And my aunt, she must have known we were coming because she left a lantern in front of the door so we would find it in the dark. And so after every tree, we expected somebody to be there. I thought, why in the world did she take me along? Well, she felt a woman and her child, nobody would bother us, see? And so that's what happened. And we did make it to the village and stayed a few days with my aunt and my grandma. Then, of course, it was time for us to get back. And that was between Christmas and New Year when we went. So, and the 23rd of January, we had to leave home. See, so, and because my mother had prepared so much and dug holes in a shed and buried dishes and all kinds of things that she wanted to save. She was busy packing, and because again we didn't know, we knew then we would leave, but we didn't know when. Because we had a German Shepherd, and his name was Briggs, and I used to be in his doghouse all the time playing with him. That was my pal, big German Shepherd. And so anyway, Mutti and I, we were in the kitchen, and we are looking out of the window, and there is this man. He's dragging Briggs away, had him by the collar over the shoulder, and he was as long, stretched out like the man was, just dragging his feet behind. And we both knew he was dead. They had poisoned him. Couldn't have a dog running around. That was Briggs. It was a very, very extreme winter, one of the hardest in history that can be checked. It was negative 20 degrees Celsius. See, so the bridges were all gone, and the soldiers had demolished them, so the Russians would take them a little longer, which was a joke. Well, Mutti, like most everybody, wanted to take everything. And the night before we left, we had soldiers, German soldiers. They were sleeping all over the place, and they highly recommended for us to get out of there soon. Well, we had to wait to have Erlaubnis. What is Erlaubnis? Permission. See, we couldn't leave very well, but that's what they told us. Well, they took our best horses with them to pull their cannons. So they left us 2 horses, one a 3-year-old, and then a heavy horse. We called him an Oldenburger, but it is something like the Clydesdale, heavy horse for pulling. Well, and that just wasn't a couple to pull this big wagon that Mutti had loaded up. And then Babka on top, Ilse, and of course I. And that morning when we were trying to leave and join the rest of the neighbors, the wagon wasn't moving. The wheels had frozen to the ground, and Mutti could not move the wagon. Well, we finally made it from the Hof onto the street. And then from then on, it was just awful. She tried to lighten the load and throw out the radio and whatever else she had to lighten the load. Well, we made it up to the river Vistula, and we were stuck in a town and waited for our turn because there were other wagons and they had to take their turns crossing the river. So we waited for our turn to get over the ice, and Mutti made sandwiches for all of them. And I remember she made a sandwich for me, and of course, everything was frozen and the butter came in pieces, and I complained that I wanted it smooth. And my mother just had it. She got so angry with me. I have never forgotten that. I never complained again. I mean, my father wasn't there to help her in any way, and she had to make decisions on her own. And so we finally got onto the river, and my mom stopped, and I was walking besides the wagon. All of a sudden, my father shows up on a bicycle. He must have heard we were leaving, so he couldn't have been far away. And my mom stopped the wagon, and he embraced her, and I stood by the side and watching all this. And then he turned around, took his bike, and left. And I was so disappointed, he ignored me completely. And I see myself still standing there on the ice and seeing my dad go. So anyway, for going on, okay, finally we got off the ice onto a road. It was a sand road with lots of holes. There was this. So we went from one hole to the other. Mutti had a fit. She beat the heck out of these horses. So we finally made it out of this awful area, and came to a place that used to be ranger station. It was completely empty, no furniture in there. The phone was in there and it worked because we kids had lots of fun with the telephone. So we were spending the night there, and there were some other neighbors too. So somebody came running in and said, Mutti, to come out. And so she went out, and the young horse died. She had pulled itself to death. She gave the other horse to another person, another farmer, and for that she had a ride. Babka, my sister, and for her, and a few things that she threw on there. And there wasn't any room for me. There were some people, their name was Peepers. They came from Arabia. They had come and stayed in our town and to give the horses a rest before we all left, see. So they had already fled from there to us. So anyway, their name was Peepers, and there was Mr. and Mrs. Peepers, and they had two daughters. There was Dorothea, she was about 24, and Martha was about 20. Well, they had me all surrounding and around it and deciding what to do now, all these people. And they looked at me, and they thought I was awfully cute, so they took me along, so fine. And so we went to the next few towns, and of course everybody decided to have lunch, and so they looked around. My mother was gone. There was not a sign of her anywhere. They couldn't find her. So I became lost. And so of course I screamed and hollered, and I knew I was lost. I couldn't swallow. It was the most awful feeling. I'm sorry. I just been dragging it with me all my life. Okay, they were stuck with me. Well, that wasn't their intention. They thought, well, maybe to the next railroad station, right? And then we could all go on by train. Well, now they were stuck with me. And so they tried leaving me in an orphanage. Well, they were overfilled. Hospitals, overfilled, nothing. So, well, they didn't want to leave me on the street either, so I had no choice. I had to go along. So, and we went on for the next few days, And then it became too hard for the horses. I mean, the weather was miserable. Then all the men were taken to fight the Russians, and Mr. Pepys had to go too. So it didn't matter how old they were. 50, 60 years old. So now it was Mrs. Pepys. We came into a town, and I was usually running after the wagon, and I was so thirsty, so I ran into a house and asked for a cup of water. And these people were so curious. Where do you come from? How long have you been on the road? And by the time I came out, the wagon was gone, and the rest of them were gone into town. And so I run, and pretty soon Fliegeralarm starts. That means bombing. And I ran, and I ran through town. And when I came out on the other end of the town, there was nobody there. So I was absolutely petrified. It was getting dark, and everybody was running to the shelters. And I've been crying and running and trying to find these crazy people, with their wagon. I ran back into town again. By then, the bombing had started. I finally found the wagon. It was parked on the side of the street. The horses were in front of it. Nobody there. So I stood there, and pretty soon Dorothea came out trying to get something from the wagon. Well, they kind of hoped they had lost me, see? Nobody asked me, where have you been? What happened? Nothing. And then I saw a woman walking along on a sidewalk, and she looked like Mutti. So I ran after her, and I screamed and hollered. Well, the woman stopped and looked around. It wasn't Mutti. So the disappointment. And another thing, we stopped. See, we always had to get off the street as refugees. We had to get off the street because the night was for the military to go to the East Sea. They had to be open, free. So we had to be off the road. And so we stopped in one of these houses that was still East Germany. But you see, I was still with the wagon then at that time. And it was a beautiful place. And we stayed there for about a week so the horses would rest. And they had lost their only child. And he was a little baby, apparently, maybe 3 or 4 years old. And they scrubbed me and cleaned me up. And they were so nice to me, the owners of the place. And I could sleep in the bed that the boy had slept, the one that died. And they had a whole box of cookies and put it near my bed, you see. So I didn't eat one cookie because I felt that would, then I would have to stay, see. And I didn't want to stay. I wanted to keep going. And so these beautiful cookies there, and believe me, I was always hungry. I didn't eat one. And so they wanted to keep me, see. And I knew that. And I didn't want to stay. I kind of always had the hope I would find Mutti. But I never found her. So anyway, so we continued then, and then it was too much for the horses. So Mrs. Pepys decided, okay, Martha, Oma, and I take a few suitcases and stuff and take the train, and she would come with the wagon, and we would meet there, in a certain place. Fine, and it worked. We actually met each other again. So other people did the same thing, figuring give the horses a break. And well, the second time it didn't work. We never met again. We will spend all day at the railroad, and by then, see, in Prussia, we didn't have any bombing at all. It was a little too far for the bombers to get to. So, and of course, the closer we got to the west, the worse it got. And of course, there was Fliegeralarm and all that, which was completely new to me. I had no idea what it was. So anyway, we waited around, nobody showed up, so we finally had to continue without them. So we were again divided. We finally ended up in a teeny little town. Fitzbeck by Kellinghusen was the name of the next town, Kellinghusen. And The farmer was awfully nice that took us in, and he gave us this wash house to live in, a wash house. They got some beds together, and so there was, I had to share a bed with Oma, you know, Grandma, and Bertha had her own bed. And so it was fine. At least it was warm in there. We were all by ourselves there. And the farmer was so kind. He introduced me to one of the little girls named Heike. It was the relatives of theirs. And she was a year younger than I am. So Heike and I, we spent a lot of time together, and I was able to spend time in her house. But you see, the war wasn't over yet. And so bombing and all that went on nightly. And there was this humongous flak, this cannon, and it's very, very powerful. And every night I saw that thing in action. So in the daytime, I had to pass this crazy thing in order to get to Heike's house. So I walked until I was never left it out of my eyes. I walked and watched it very carefully. Then I turned around when I was past and watched it and went backwards. So I wouldn't, because I was so afraid of this, but the racket that thing makes. So I didn't trust it. So Heike and I, one day we were up in the attic and playing, and all of a sudden we heard this commotion going on outside. I mean, there were planes flying, and whatever, must have been British, because by then Germany didn't have any more planes. And so we opened the lookout. You know what a lookout is? A gate, a door, and we laid down flat on our bellies, and we watched. And the soldiers, they weren't prepared. They were being attacked, these German. Men, oh men, oh men, I tell you, they were scrambling like crazy, and we watched the whole thing up there, flat on our bellies. I mean, they could have shot us too, you know. These things I haven't forgotten. The war was over. First the Germans come back from the Rhine, you know, the soldiers, and oh boy, and retreating from the Rhine area. And didn't take very long, here come the British, see. And my goodness, did they celebrate. War was over. They were shooting everything and everywhere, and beautiful crystal that the farmer had out of the window, you know, they were so stinking drunk. And so we were just flat, because you better not stand up, you might get shot. So anyway, after a few days, it kind of calmed down a bit. And they got a lot of packages supply from America. And I never will forget, it's corned beef. Every time I see corned beef, it sticks in my mind. What happened, they dug holes in the ground, so whenever they finished the cans, they buried them, put them in the hole and buried them. Well, we kids would, there were several other kids, we'd get into these holes and licked out the cans. And of course, corned beef has wonderful fat in there, you know. And so they were always the best. We were always hungry, nothing. And one day, I look around and they eat this beautiful white bread, and they had thrown it on a misthaufen, you know, in a manure pile. And I looked at that, and I kind of looked a little brownish. I was thinking of getting that bread. Then I make a friend with one of them, with one of these soldiers, British soldiers, and he kind of, maybe he had children at home, but he felt sorry for me. So he always went with horse and buggy for supplies and took me along. And I always got something to eat. He always fed me. And sometimes even got a little chocolate or so. But that corned beef, I will never forget that, never. So, kids, you don't know what hunger is. So now, by then, I was outgrowing my dress. I only had one dress. So my shoes, nothing fit anymore. And so Martha, you couldn't go to the store and buy something. So she got hold of a bed sheet, and it was white and blue checkered. And this is something they had for the help, if they had helpers on the farm, because the family itself only white sheets. So everybody knew where that sheet came from. So she had a dress made out for me, and I felt so bad because now I was a little peasant girl. Out of the blue, here comes a Suri with a horse, and it turned out it was the mother, Mrs. Pepys, that had found out where her daughter and the grandma is, see. And like I said, soldiers came back first from the Rhine, and she got familiar with them, and then they moved on, and then I think it must have been a German soldier that there was this woman crying about her daughter and the grandma and all that, and he seemed to know that it was us, and he knew exactly where we were. So the war is barely over, you know, here she comes. That was really amazing. And I didn't even have time to say goodbye to Heike. So we didn't have much to pack and get under Surrey, and off we went. And but I have no idea how we got over the River Elbe, because everything was broken and the tunnel was full of water. And so there must have, I think, I've been reading one book, and there was one bridge standing, and it had to be that bridge that we passed over, you know, came through Hamburg. There was nothing standing. Everything was, you know, how that looked like. And so we get onto two-way road, and in Germany they often have these trees on both sides, and it was a Sunday morning, and it was kind of rainy. So we took along on that road there, and Mrs. Pepys, all of a sudden, there's somebody coming our way. She looks, she says, there's somebody on a bike, and she looks, and she says, it's my dad. It's Herr Gatzke. Can you imagine the surprise? I got off, I wouldn't believe, I screamed and hollered. There was Papa in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing there, no traffic. I mean, you have no idea how dead it was after the war and everything was over. It was completely dead, no traffic, nothing. And there's Papa on a bicycle. So later on he was asked, how in the world did you find her? He says, es war ein Zufall. And he never talked about it, never mentioned it. And what had happened, he had found my mom in the meantime, and there's another story how he got out, and he left everything behind. I mean, they were shooting deserters, you know that. But anyway, in order to please my mom, he would go from town to town and see who's in town, because when you're staying there longer than a week, at that time anyway, you had to report by the Bürgermeister, you know, sign in. And so the Bürgermeister would know exactly who's in town. Any refugee, anything, they had to report. So he did that. He made a circle bigger and bigger. And every Sunday he made, I guess this was hopeless for him. But I could have been anywhere at all. So, but in order to keep her happy, he drives along and goes from town to town checking who's in town. And so he widened out his road. That's what he did. So we were not too far from the Autobahn, because we walked most of the way. We walked on the Autobahn, and left and right there was nothing but panzers and you've seen pictures how it looks like, stuff all over the place, but no traffic, not one, nothing, no car, nothing. So we walked under Autobahn to Horstedt. Then we came to the forest, and of course I was always hungry, and I ran after Papa, and then I saw these beautiful berries. I said, Papa, what are they? And I'd never seen a blueberry before, and he says, well, they're blueberry. I said, can I eat them? He says, sure. So he kept going, he didn't even stop. So I picked a few blueberries and ate them, and then ran after him and picked a few more. So, and then we came into town, and there were so many children. And I said, Papa, is this ein Armenhaus, a poor house? The poor houses always had a lot of kids. He said, no, it's not the poor house. So we kept going, and we come to the center of Stapel. And by then, the word got out. He found somebody, see? I was running after him, he was pushing the bike. And and then of course everybody came running out, and they all stood around me and looked at me. When you look up, I just saw faces. Do you think there's somebody hugs you or gives you a kiss? No, never, never. So my mother was just screaming too, you know, there I am. And of course, Belings, well, they took in Mutti and Ilse. What the farmers would do, refugees coming in from the east, and they usually gathered in the middle of town somewhere, and the wood got around, and the farmers would come and pick what they needed to work on the farm. So Mutti looked somewhat a good worker, and that, of course, she had Ilse. And so, okay, and then didn't take very long, okay, my dad found her, see? So, okay, now there was, and food was scarce, see? So they had another mouth to feed, and now I come along, so it's the whole family there. So Papa, what he did, he went to Bremen, this was bombed out. He found whatever he needed there in the rubbles. Building material, see, and put it on his bike and pushed it. It was about 30 kilometers that he walked each time. And in the attic, he built us a room, and it was wonderful. There was a skylight, and it was nice and bright inside, and furniture, he made them himself, you know, to sit on. Somehow he got a table from somewhere, but he had made a bench, and so we could sit around the table. And then by then, we got a stove somehow, I don't remember from where. But so Mutti was so happy. She could cook her own meals. And farmer was kind enough. His wife was not very nice, but the farmer was kind. He gave us a piece of land to grow vegetables. And then they had this old shed, and it was a Hühnerstall, and so Papa built them a brand new one. And we, in return, he gave us the old one. And that was wonderful. We were able to have a pig, and we had chickens, and so we were no longer hungry. So, and then of course he decided I should learn a profession of some sort. But again, they were hard to find, these places. And I was also interested in photography, and there was a photographer that had a shop in a town called Ottersberg, not too far away from Stapel. But this man was a bachelor, and since he was a bachelor, I couldn't stay in the house with him, see? The house was big enough, but I could have a room, my own room, but still I was a young girl, and you just don't stay there in this house with a bachelor. So that was out. So my father then decided, well, I could learn housekeeping and cooking. So, and he knew some people, so he made the arrangements with the place in Eversen. And they were very kind to me. They took me in, but then I was so terribly homesick. I could only get home every 6 weeks and just stay overnight. That's all. And so then I would cry for 2 weeks because I was so homesick. And then after a year, my father decided to find me something close to home, so I could come home more often. Many people at that time, if they have daughters, they actually exchange daughters. The idea was that everybody does things different. The cooking, even if you are in Germany and all that, but everybody does things different. And so that's why they exchanged. So I took the space that this lady, this young girl, left. I was kind of filling in, so to speak, for a year. And that was nothing much to do. I mean, there was a woman that came and cleaned the house. I mean, I didn't do much. I maybe dusted a little and made the beds. So the afternoon was mine, so that was great. And Sundays where I could go home, stay over on a weekend at home, so that was great. Yeah, but then after a year, this young girl came home, so I had to leave. And okay. By then, Papa helped me to get my papers ready for America. But I had to be 18, see. I had to be 18 years old. Papa first, he was more interested in pushing me in that direction. Now, what do I know? I did whatever he told me. And I remember there was this man coming from the embassy in Hamburg, and they checked me out. He talked to the neighbors and talked to my dad, and I had to write this letter, which I showed you, and they wanted to know more about me, whether I have a record of any kind with the police, or do I have a bank account even. So, then I had to bring X-ray for my lungs. I had to go to Hamburg to the embassy. They checked my lungs. They didn't want to let me go because they were all full of marks. I've been very, very sick, and that was after I was found. I became very, very sick, and it must have been pneumonia. So, but it had healed over, so they figured it's okay. My lungs are fine. But there was another girl my age, but she couldn't go. They wouldn't let her go. But all in all, it took a long time. Like I said, I had to be 18. Okay, what now? He didn't want me to work with the farmers there. They were all so mean. So he found this place in Zottrum again. It was a doctor's place. And just to fill in again, they were extremely mean to me, very, very nasty. And I came home crying all the time. They didn't give me enough to eat. They had me in a kitchen. I had a bell over the table, so they wanted something. They pushed the bell and I had to come running. And so they treated me like a real maid. And I was constantly crying. So Papa brought me a sandwich or whatever. Mutti made me sandwiches when I came to visit. And because they didn't give me much. The rolls are not very big, and she was going to give me one. And I asked, could I have two? And most of my money that I earned, I would spend for food because they didn't feed me. Then I ate alone in the kitchen and sit there crying. And so by then my father had enough of this, and I actually had a nervous breakdown. This was unbelievable. I have never been treated so bad as they treated me there. It was just absolutely horrible. So Papa said, you're coming home. And he came. And he explained it to them that I was finished with my nerves and everything else. And he was taking me home. And he did. He did. Papa, what did I do without him? So, Papa was not well. And he was in a hospital for a long, long time. And it turned out it was leukemia. So they sent him home to die. And when he came home, I had to get him his medication. So I went to Sotrum, and he knew these people well. They had a drugstore. And I banged on every window and door because it was after hours. Finally, I got somebody, and I wanted to show them what I wanted. And they were so sad because they knew Papa well. And they knew what the pills were about. They were just painkillers. And so whenever he didn't see me, I always want to know where am I? He asked every day, have you gotten your visa? No, I haven't gotten my visa. And the day he died, and that was early in the morning, in the afternoon, my visa came from Hamburg. Anyway, I knew he was dying. So I put a great big clock on the table, cut the family Bible out, and I sat there and I waited. And I waited. I waited for his last breath. One more, one, then no more. And then I wrote it in the Bible what time he died. And I couldn't cry. I couldn't even cry. That's all I had is Papa. And so it was okay for me to leave. I wasn't homesick. I was miserable here because I didn't like the food and I didn't like anything about it and didn't speak the language. And so, yeah, it was hard. But Papa was no longer home, so it was okay. So anyway, getting on this crazy ship, first I said, Papa, what do you think I should take? Fly or take a ship? Oh, he says, oh, these ships are wonderful. They're like a city. You get your hair done and all this and that. He talked of like a princess ship. Well, I thought, okay, I take a ship. And what a disappointment. They take us to Bremerhaven. I stayed 2 weeks in Überseeheim. It's near Bremen. So we get to Bremerhaven and see this crazy ship, gray and terrible looking. And it is this troop transporter. And people, they were disappointed. They said, well, the Jews are getting even with us. There wasn't even enough food on board. They said, well, give it a few days and you have some food. They counted on people getting sick. Can you imagine? And that's where I saw the first time I saw a black person. And they divided the women on that side, the men on that side. So we slept in these hangars where the soldiers used to sleep. Can you imagine? So 10 o'clock at night, light off. No, and there was just a metal. The waves were hitting this side, and by then I couldn't care less whether that thing sank or not. I had it. I had enough. I had enough of the rest of my life. So there was this horrible storm. Everything was roped off on top. The waves, when they were coming over the ship, they were green, you know. So, you know, they were tremendous if they are green looking. And I sat on there on a bench all alone. I couldn't care less if I get swept overboard or not. I didn't care. I had no idea where I was going. It wasn't my idea anyway, so it was my father's idea. But so I arrived in New York finally. We stayed overnight where the Statue of Liberty is. Well, that didn't mean a thing to me, that big thing there. You know, they made a big fuss over it. But we stayed overnight there. See, so if you came in too early, then I guess they had to pay to be in the harbor. And so next morning they got us all off the ships, and then all of a sudden it dawns on me, oh my God, now what? I don't have a dime in my pocket. I don't know anything, nothing. I don't speak the language. I don't know, I had no idea how in the world do I get now to Cleveland, because they promised Papa that somebody would be there to pick me up in New York, but there wasn't. There was no one there. Then I asked around who's going to Cleveland, and then I found a family. It was a man and a wife and two girls, little girls. I thought, well, if they're going to Cleveland, at least there's a man there. So I stuck with them. I don't know their name. I have no idea who they were or what, but all I knew, they were going to Cleveland. So I stuck wherever they went. They went to the bathroom, I went too. I didn't let them out of my eyes. And so finally, we got to the airport, not the airport, the railroad station, and I had a tag here, which I couldn't read, so I would imagine my aunt had paid for the trip, and the trip to Cleveland too, so it was paid. Anyway, we did get to Cleveland, which you see Cleveland in that big tower, that was Rose End, so to speak. And Tante Emma must have been knew that I was coming, because she was there. She had rented a taxi and picked me up there. So that was my trip to America.